home to serve the country in the United States House of Representatives. We're thankful for the work that they have done and continue to do for this country, for our democracy, and certainly for veterans. Veterans who are now at risk because of the extreme MAGA Republican behavior with respect to this manufactured MAGA default crisis. Now, America should always pay our bills and keep the promises that we've made to Social Security recipients, to women, to children, to families, and certainly to our veterans. But Republicans are driving us down a dangerous road of default, or have presented the American people with another unacceptable choice, which is devastating cuts to children, devastating cuts to Medicaid, devastating cuts to nutrition, devastating cuts to education, devastating cuts to public safety, and devastating cuts to our veterans. That is unacceptable, unconscionable, and un-American. And we're going to continue to fight against it. And I'm thankful that leading this fight are those members of Congress who are closest to the veterans community because they are veterans themselves. And I want to yield first to a distinguished Vietnam War veteran who has been a champion for the veterans community, a champion for the values that veterans so wonderfully have espoused, and for military families throughout the nation. Chairman Mike Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Leader. Thank you for bringing us together. It's an honor to be on this stage with fellow veterans from our caucus. This is extremely important time for veterans. As the leader said, this is a manufactured crisis that's going to play hard on veterans. Veterans VA appointments are going to be canceled because of this. There's 900,000 veterans who depend upon care providers. Those care providers aren't going to receive any pay if we go over this fiscal cliff, this financial cliff. 450,000 VA employees won't get their pay. Veterans depend upon them for services. And as the leader said, it's not just the veterans programs, but it's everything else from health care and public safety. Veterans are impacted by all of that. So any veterans wanting to buy a house, interest rates go up, they get hit. Any veterans using their credit card, interest rates, they get hit. Any veteran wanting to buy a car, interest rates go up, they get hit again. Veterans have given enough. They don't need to be hit again, especially by a manufactured crisis. The Republicans should keep us here in Washington, D.C. this weekend. We should get this thing behind us. We should take care of the American people and the veterans that are being impacted by their irresponsible behavior. It's my honor to introduce a distinguished Navy veteran and a great colleague of ours, Mikey Sherrill.
Thank you. Very kind. You were just making fun of the Navy, so. Nice of you. Nice of you. No, it is wonderful to be here today. In fact, you're seeing some of the more bipartisan members of our caucus in our veterans. I was just with Mike this morning, our Vietnam veteran, to clean the Vietnam Wall with the Four Country Caucus, a bipartisan group of veterans. Because when you're asked to serve, you don't sign anything that affiliates you to any political party. You're asked to serve your country. And I think that's why we are so concerned today as we look at the Republican proposals and how harmful they are to our veterans. One of the early pieces of legislation I passed was the Blue Water Navy Act, taking care of members of the Blue Water Navy from the Vietnam era who had been exposed to Agent Orange. Imagine that, decades after their service, colleagues who had died from that exposure, they were just getting the support they needed. So we worked incredibly hard to pass the PACT Act to protect veterans who'd been exposed to toxic fumes and gases. And the president's budget funded that, and the Republicans have now cut $12 billion from the Toxic Exposures Fund with their budget. When they say that this isn't going to harm veterans, they're not being upfront about what this will do to veterans. You just heard about what this could do to our veterans community. And as veterans, we care very much about promoting freedom and equality and justice. And to see that these attacks on the United States dollar, these attacks on the full faith and credit of the United States of America as we come into Memorial Day weekend, flies in the face of all that we've fought for. So that is why we're here today, to say that we must lift, we must not default on our debt. We must lift this. We must make sure that we can, in fact, continue to support our veterans, especially as we remember their service and their sacrifice this Memorial Day weekend. Thank you, and I will now turn it over to a wonderful Army vet, Jason Crow. Thanks, Jason. It was hard for me to say.
We do love the Navy, Mikey. I'm Jason Crow from Colorado. It's a pleasure to be here with Leader Jeffries and with my fellow veterans. It is not a pleasure, however, to be talking about something as basic as caring for our veterans and maintaining the solemn and sacred oath that we make to our veterans and our servicemen and women. You know, there's a saying that you shouldn't tell me what your values are. You should show me your budget, and then I'll tell you what your values are. You know, the rank hypocrisy of some people in this town who are willing, without shame, to go up and talk about our veterans, who will spend time with our Gold Star families heading into Memorial Day weekend, and yet are willing to make drastic cuts to basic health care that our men and women earned and deserve in service to our country is unacceptable. And we are here to call it out because we know this sacred oath, we know this sacred promise. When our young men and women get up and they raise their right hand, generation after generation, raise their right hand and take that oath. And to fulfill that oath, some of them will have to give their lives. They'll spend time away from their families, missed holidays, missed birthdays, injuries, post-traumatic stress. That's what that oath means. But it's a reciprocal oath. It flows two ways. They take that oath because our country makes an oath to them that if they need care, that if they give their lives in service to this country, that our nation will be there for their family, for their children. That is an oath that should be without question, that should be unbreakable. And yet here we are. Because of gamesmanship by the House Republicans, it is in question. It's unacceptable. We are here to call it out. We are here to keep faith with that oath and to fight for our brothers and sisters because they have so dutifully fought for us. Back to Speaker Jeffries.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Mikey, and thank you, Jason. Thank you to all of the distinguished members of the caucus who have dedicated their life to service for the American people, for our values, and for veterans and military families. Let me yield briefly to the Vice Chair of the House Democratic Caucus, Ted Lieu.
Thank you, Leader Jeffries, for your exceptional leadership, and to the terrific speakers we just had. I want to mention the other people we have with us today. We have Congressman Chris DeLuzio from Pennsylvania, Congressman Ruben Gallego from Arizona, Congressman Jeff Jackson from North Carolina. We have the ranking member of the Veterans Committee, Mark Takano. We have the ranking member of the Appropriations Subcommittee, Military Affairs and Veterans Affairs, Debbie Wasserman-Schultz. And you have the Air Force representative here, me. And I want to just talk real briefly about why we know Republicans want to cut funding to veterans. One, they already did it in the Default on America Act. They claw back provisions that had money for the VA. And it's going to put 22% cuts to veterans funding. And how do we know that? Because they didn't protect that funding. They had a choice. They went ahead and protected some companies who were going to get tax credits, and they put that protection in, but they specifically did not do that for veterans. So we know they want to cut veterans funding, and if we default, that's going to hurt veterans in a very big way. And so with that, let me give it back to you, Leader Jeffries.
Thank you, Vice Chair Lieu. On-topic questions first.
On the negotiations generally, I think that counts. I mean, how closely are you being kept apprised of the state of the negotiations between the White House and House Republicans? And are you and your members prepared to vote for something that includes some of the devastating cuts you just described if that's what the president agrees to?
It's clear to me that President Biden is continuing to hold the line as it relates to the types of devastating cuts that Republicans are trying to jam down the throats of the American people, including making sure that he stands up for our veterans. It's unacceptable that on the one hand, you have Republicans pretending as if they would never cut anything that will adversely impact the health, the safety, or the well-being of veterans and military families, but doing the exact opposite, as has been outlined by our members. And it's my expectation that those cuts that have been proposed by Republicans, that they are trying to extract as a result of holding the economy hostage and continuing to threaten default, will not be before the Congress because of the advocacy of the veteran services organizations, the advocacy of these members, and President Biden and Democrats continuing to hold the line.
Thanks, Leader. There's been a lot of talk about blame from both sides, but I'm wondering if the two sides reach a deal and we avoid default, will you give Speaker McCarthy credit for that?
Right now, we're focused on making sure that we protect the health, the safety, the economic well-being of the American people, that America pays our bills, that we don't dangerously default. But what is clear to me increasingly is that many extreme MAGA Republicans have made the political calculation that a dangerous default and crashing the economy and triggering a recession is in their political interests. That is unpatriotic. But that's not speculation on the part of Democrats. That is what extreme MAGA Republicans continue to say out loud, including most recently the chairwoman of the Republican National Committee.
And do you think negotiators should be in the room right now?
It's my understanding that the designees of both President Biden as well as Speaker McCarthy will continue to talk, but it is unfortunate that House Republicans have chosen to get out of town before sundown when we are facing a dangerous default and the possibility of our economy crashing.
Hakeem Jeffries said yesterday at the White House, and I quote, "Some House Republicans refer to preventing default as the only concession they are willing to make. But," she said, "preventing a catastrophic default is not a concession, it's their job." So as someone who is on the inside of negotiations, what kind of concessions are you asking from Republicans to make? And what is the absolute red line for you, given that Senator Schumer said last week that you are not willing to sacrifice your values? So are the veterans that red line that you're not willing to cross? And also I would like to ask you, do you think that former President Trump still has a big say over a faction of the Republican Party that wants America to default? Or do you think that
Well, I can answer that question right now easily. Yes. President Trump clearly continues to hold tremendous sway, and that's one of the reasons why we're in this situation, because he has effectively told them to default, unless the extreme MAGA Republicans can extract painful cuts, such as those that would impact our veterans. That is a red line for us, and let me yield to Debbie Wasserman Schultz and Mark Takano to explain why it's a red line that we cannot cross.
I want to just be clear, without repeating too much of what my colleagues have said about what happened this week. the Milcon VA bill is usually the first up because it's always bipartisan, you know, even when you have two sides voting differently. We craft that bill together. We support our veterans. We support our military service members. That bill, that bill's markup was canceled along with the rest of them because the Republicans didn't have the votes, because they didn't want to come to that committee and have that stain on their record of having disrespected and broken the promise that we made a year ago to our veterans to make sure that we were going to protect them from toxic exposures, that we weren't going to have the entire rest of the discretionary budget dollars swallowed up by the cost of their health care. It clawed back $2 billion, a $2 billion rescission from VA medical care. So they are protesting like stuck pigs, in spite of the fact that when faced with the truth, they know that, and the evidence is there, and that's why they didn't have that vote today, because none of them wanted. They can speak really loudly. It didn't change the fact that they would have had that stain on their record, breaking their promise to our veterans, which is in black and white in that bill.
And to add to what Ranking Member Wassman Schultz has said, what's essentially going on is Republicans are trying to, these so-called negotiations, which I don't believe should be happening. What's coming up before us is the date by which we need to get our bonds sold. We need to make sure that we make good on the bills that we need to pay. But, you know, the government's funded till the end of September. And the vote that they were supposed to take in appropriations was on the Milcon VA bill. They do not have the votes to make the cuts that they are trying to bully the president into making, because they want the president to share in the blame. The president already put out a detailed budget, reducing the deficit, and not only beholden to cuts. So they're trying to bully their way into cuts that their own caucus cannot pass. I would love to see at the end of September them to be able to produce an appropriations bill which actually makes the cuts that they want. I'm going to tell you, this can't happen in 4 days. I authored the PACT Act. It passed last summer, and you will recall that they called the cost of war toxic exposure fund. Senator Toomey said it was a slush fund, and that's why he couldn't support it. Flipped 21 votes in the Senate, high-fiving with Ted Cruz on the floor that they stopped this, and it was only after veterans slept on the Senate steps and shamed the Congress, shamed the Senate into putting the bill back into the House where we finally passed it, that the Republicans knuckled under. We had a bipartisan agreement to not put the cost of war, we had a bipartisan agreement to fund the cost of war and not make it compete with the other domestic priorities and not make it compete with defense. The mark they put yesterday, in which they didn't want to, the stain that they did not want to have on their records, was they did not want the stain of clawing back $2 billion. They didn't want the stain of putting $15 billion into discretionary spending to actually rob veterans of housing, rob veterans of SNAP benefits. They too rely on the domestic side of the ledger. So my thing is, they're bullying through, they're trying to bully through cuts that they cannot even get the votes for in their own caucus.
Last question.
Thank you, Mr. Leader. We'll actually do two if that's okay. But number one, do you think the president made a mistake not engaging Speaker McCarthy earlier on this debt limit issue? And then secondly, with respect to the discharge petition, if there's no deal by the weekend, have you identified 5 Republicans who will sign on to that to move that forward?
Well, President Biden engaged with House Republicans at the earliest opportunity it's important for everyone to accurately lock in on the actual timeline. President Biden and Speaker McCarthy met in the Oval Office on February 1st. At that meeting, President Biden said, Democrats, through our administration, will produce our budget on March 9th. And we need Republicans to produce your budget immediately thereafter, so we can understand what the basis of any conversation should be about the appropriate levels of spending moving forward, while at the same time making it clear that America should always pay our bills, avoid a default, and do it in the way that has been done under Democratic presidents and Republican presidents, including 3 times by House Democrats under the former president, Donald Trump, without gamesmanship, partisanship, and brinksmanship. On March 9th, President Biden produces his budget that will protect and strengthen Social Security, build an economy that works for everyday Americans, cut the deficit by an additional $3 trillion on top of the $1.7 trillion that were already cut by the Biden administration over the previous 2 years. And then we were waiting for House Republicans to produce their budget. And in early March, they failed to produce their budget. Mid-March, failed to produce their budget. End of March, failed to produce their budget. Early April, failed to produce their budget. Mid-April, failed to produce their budget. Then on April 25th, they don't produce a budget, they produce the Default on America Act, a ransom note with extreme cuts that will hurt veterans, military families, and everyday Americans. They pass it on April 26th, with George Santos, serial fraudster, being the deciding vote. On April 27th, they get out of town. In fact, many of them were overseas. Don't come back into town until the second Tuesday of May, which is the very day that Joe Biden convened the 4 legislative leaders in the Oval Office. It's a fiction to believe that President Biden has not been engaging in conversations with the other side of the aisle. He did it at the earliest possible moment. This is a Republican talking point that is not anchored in any reality. So yes, I believe the president has been incredibly responsible in how he has conducted himself. To the second part of your question, House Democrats are unified in avoiding a default. And it will take only 5 reasonable Republicans to end this madness, to avoid the economy from crashing, to prevent a job-killing recession by joining us. Only 5 out of 222 to end this madness, avoid a default, and make sure that everyday Americans are protected. That's the commitment that these members and House Democrats have made. And we only need 5 Republicans to join us. Thank you.